Today is day 4. We're looking at supply shifters. Quick review of last class. Our ticket out. Why are producers willing to supply more when the price increases? It's because they can make a profit. They can cover all of their costs. And then when we have both the demand and supply curve together, it should look like this. Sort of creates an X on the graph. Taking a look at the do now that you did for today, it looks something similar to this, in which you added up each of the quantities to get a market quantity supplied. So 2 and 1, we would get 3, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to get 4, 8, 13, 13, 18, and 18, there we go, 6, 8, 17, 23. And then you take that data and you go down below and you're going to graph it here, and we do this just like what we've always been doing, our price and quantity, and then we would put all of our price points there on the y-axis and quantities on the x-axis, and when we plot those points, we're going to have something that looks like this, and we connect those dots and we label it S1. For the scenario down on the bottom, question number 6, it said, what if the price increased from 50 cents to $1? Well, we could take that price point of 50 cents, call that P1, and that would give us quantity 1. And if there's a price increase, we would put P2 up here, and quantity 2 would be down there, and we would show that quantity supplied increase. And that's it for the do now. We went over a few of the homework problems that students did. There we go. So looking at these graphs on the left, we should identify this as a supply curve. We have it's an increase, movement on the curve, therefore it's quantity supplied, so an increase in quantity supplied. The second one is going to be the opposite, a decrease in quantity supplied. The third one is a demand curve, and it's showing movement down the curve, which is a quantity demand, and it's an increase. And the last one is a quantity demand decrease. The back page of the homework, taking a look at this one, the first sentence says, you are a farmer selling tomatoes. So we have to look at this from the perspective of a producer. And so we draw a graph, quantity, price, draw a supply curve, labeled S1. And the price of tomatoes increased from $1 to $3. So price 2 gives us quantity 1 and quantity 2. And so we show movement up the curve, which would be a change in quantity supplied. The reason is because there is a change in price. Number 9. You decide to buy a house. We're looking at this from the perspective of a consumer. We set up our graph the same way, and this is, I'm a consumer, so I'm going to create a demand curve, label it D1, and notice the average cost of a home has risen from $225,000 to $250,000. So I'm seeing a price increase, and put P2 up a little higher. And because there's a price increase, there's going to be a quantity demanded decrease because of a change in price. The last homework problem was a review of demand shifters, and we set up our graph the same way, draw our demand curve, and this one we're talking about trans fats and KFC using trans fats to produce its chicken. People are not going to want to buy as much. So we're going to have a shift to the right, and the reason is because of consumers' tastes and preferences. So that's a review of the work that we've done so far. You should be up to speed, feeling pretty good about that. The last topic that we'll look at here this week is supply changes. So what causes supply to change? Again, we're going to identify, draw, and explain how supply changes by reading scenarios and then showing those changes on a graph and explaining why they changed. This ties into our second standard, supply and specifically supply shifters. Key terms, these are the last 3 key terms before our next quiz, which is tomorrow. There's about 58 terms total. 8 of them are new terms. So we're talking about a change in supply. This is what a change in supply looks like. Notice the similarity to demand, price and quantity, both on the x and the y axis. Our first curve is always a sub 1. Our second curve is always labeled sub 2. A decrease is always shown as a shift to the left, and an increase is always shown as a shift to the right. The only difference here is that a supply has a positive sloped curve versus our demand curve, which is negatively sloped. Taking a look at each of these graphs now, each of these supply graphs, we see A and B would be both supply changes. A is a supply increase, B is a supply decrease, C is a quantity supplied increase, and D is a quantity supplied decrease. Now previously we had drawn this graphic organizer in our notes, and we talked about price and how that affects supply, specifically quantity supplied, and it creates those 2 types of graphs that are shown there. For today we want to look at the non-price factors, and there's 6. There's 6 non-price factors that affect both demand and supply. Some are similar, but there's 2 different sets. So these are those 6. Number of producers would be basically the number of companies, the number of firms that are supplying a particular good or service. If new businesses start up, it's going to increase our supply. If businesses shut down or go bankrupt, it decreases our supply. Change in the cost of inputs, I'm going to come back to that one. Natural disasters and political crises, let's say a hurricane comes in and wipes out a bunch of businesses, that's going to create a decrease in supply. A political crisis like a revolution or a civil war is not going to be very conducive to businesses. Therefore, businesses are going to shut down, and typically natural disasters, political crises will create supply decreases. Changes in technology. Let's say that there's a new technology that comes out that allows companies to make things much more quickly, much faster, much more cheaply. Therefore, we're going to have a supply increase. Producer expectations. This is a lot like consumer expectations in that we're thinking about what's going to happen to the price in the future. As a producer, if I go back to selling tomatoes, the example from the homework, if I know that the price of tomatoes is going to go up in the future, my supply right now is going to decrease. I'm going to decrease the supply and wait to sell it when the price goes up. And so what are we expecting the price to be in the future affects our supply right now. And the last one is government policies, and I'll talk about that after we talk about change in the cost of inputs. So let's do that now. Change in the cost of inputs. We are familiar with this if we think back to the factors of production. And inputs are any factor of production or resource that are used to make a good or a service. We had talked about toothpaste and how toothpaste is made. All of those things that go into making toothpaste we call inputs. And those things cost money. You can refer back to the circular flow model. And firms have to buy the factors of production from households. Therefore, these things cost a certain amount of money to the firms. And if those things change their price, then it's going to affect how much a company is able to make. So, for example, an increased cost of inputs is going to produce an increased production cost. Therefore, it's more expensive to make the product, and our supply is going to decrease. It will shift to the left. On the other hand, we could have decreased cost of inputs. Maybe the inputs are cheaper, and we have decreased production cost, so it's less expensive to make the product, and we have a supply increase. One thing to note here is that minimum wage. What we pay workers can have an effect on production costs. So if minimum wage goes up, now it's more expensive to produce goods and services, which can lead to a supply decrease. Government policies is the last factor, and there's 2 types of government policies that we will need to know: subsidies and excise tax. A subsidy is any payment aimed at helping a producer to continue to operate. It's basically free money. Back in 2008, when during the Great Recession, the U.S. government gave the auto manufacturers billions of dollars to help them stay in business, because if they didn't stay in business, they would have gone bankrupt, they would have laid off thousands of workers, and that would mean thousands of Americans without jobs, not consuming and buying things, which creates a downward spiral and can lead to economic ruin really fast. And so a subsidy is a way of helping out a business. And it's going to decrease production costs, and it can actually help to increase supply. On the other hand, you can have an excise tax, and that's going to be a tax on the manufactured sale of a good. It's an indirect tax. Gas, gasoline, tobacco, alcohol are the most common items on which there's an excise tax. So whoever is making that product pays this tax to the federal government, to the state government. You and I, as consumers, we don't pay that directly. We would pay it indirectly because whoever makes the gas is going to increase the overall cost of gas to pay for that excise tax. And so what it does is it makes it more expensive to produce something, so increased production costs, and it increases supply. We have a couple of practice problems, so you can pause the video, take a look at it, and then I will go over it. So for the first one, lumber goes up in price. Lumber is used to make new homes, therefore it is an input, and we're going to have a supply decrease because now it's more expensive to produce homes, so we're going to make fewer homes. Number two, during the real estate boom, it causes house prices to rise. More homeowners put their houses up for sale. So for this one, we're not having a shift to the left or to the right. The only thing that's changing is price. Therefore, we can get rid of our A and B, and because prices are going up, we know that quantity supplied also has to go up. Therefore, it's letter C. Number three, we have many strawberry farmers open roadside stands during harvest season. So that means we have an increased number of producers. Therefore, our supply is going to increase as well. And number four, the Minnesota legislature increases the sin tax on tobacco and alcohol. So here's an example of a government policy and a tax that is going to affect the cost of production, and it's going to be more expensive to make things. That leads to a supply decrease. For your homework for tomorrow, supply practice worksheet number 2. You can see me for a copy. There's extra copies on Schoology. And then study your key terms for tomorrow's key terms quiz. Good luck.